I have started recording. Good afternoon once again, folks. New York City, it's 12:02. I'm your host, Gene Gendel, the organizer of New York City Largescale Scrum Group. Today, we have a very interesting event. In the studio, we will have Michael James, and I will give a quick introduction to Michael just in a second. But before I do that, a few quick rules. Could you please remain on mute throughout the entire duration of the event, unless we open it up for questions, and then please kindly unmute yourself and ask a question, and then mute yourself back again, so we can minimize the background noise. We also have a chat window where you're welcome to put your questions and comments, and I'll be going through those and picking and choosing the ones that Michael would like to answer at his pace. So without any further ado, let me give a quick intro to Michael. Michael James was selected as a Scrum trainer all the way back in 2006 as one of Scrum's original proponents, by one of Scrum original proponents, Ken Schwaber. Michael helped many organizations in many countries with adoption of Scrum. He also produced the most successful illustrated distillation of Scrum's definition and the Scrum Master's Checklist. Many of you have used it, I'm sure. Michael is a software mentor, team coach, and Scrum trainer with skills in product ownership and Scrum mastery, as well as engineering practices, including test-driven development, refactoring, CI/CD, as well as pair programming. Michael has been involved with LESS longer than anyone else on the US West Coast. He is also a recovering software architect with programming experience that goes back all the way to 1970. Which means he had his hands on the code at one point in his career, including some past engagements. His work is so valuable, in fact, that there are some volunteers around the globe that have translated it to 16 languages. And some may have seen Michael's work in different languages. So with that, I'm going to ask Michael to step up to the podium. And at the moment, you see a very nice last banner in the background. Welcome, Michael.
Hello, Gene.
On over to you. And the floor is yours. And please set the stage, set the tone, pace yourself, and decide how you want to take questions.
Yeah, speaking of pacing, I'll use this because it's a monitor, I think. I don't know how long this will go. I didn't actually rehearse it.
Well, we'll go cold turkey into this. So
yeah. We've got some stuff and during this presentation. Feel free to tweet stuff to me or follow me on Twitter, michael.james. If there are questions, you can also use the chat window if you like. But if you want to get them directly to me, please follow me. Let's get into the talk. So, by the way, Gene, thank you for setting up this group. I'm impressed with what you've been able to do with this meetup. It's very cool.
Thank you.
And, appreciate you having me here. We've copied your idea. We started a Seattle area meetup for people on the West Coast time. I'm here in Seattle, where we're all under lockdown. So I hope everyone else is keeping safe and healthy and dealing with all the stress. In this talk, we're going to give 4 definitions, and then we're going to cover 4 misconceptions about multi-team Scrum and Agile, software development in particular. Now, those 4 misconceptions, one of them has 5 variations, so you might call that 9 misconceptions. And we'll see how the time works with that. At the very end, while we have a bonus topic we'll get into, 7 alternatives to Scrum of Scrums. And at the end, we'll reveal, I think, the main misconception that I'll say 90% of Agile coaches and even quite a few Scrum trainers and other people still have about multiple team software development, and how those misconceptions are counterproductive towards our intended aims. They're actually harmful, I'll suggest. But it's useful to understand the definitions and the prior assumptions before we get to that. So we'll get to that at the end. The topics I'm covering, yeah, we may or may not put this recording online. So far, I haven't been happy with my live video recordings, but maybe this will be the one that I actually like. But what we did do is put together a packet, and we'll give you the link for this of material. This is really follow-up for the comic book, which you may have read. This went viral on LinkedIn faster than anything else I've written, including the Scrum Master checklist and the videos and everything else. For some reason, this really hit a nerve. Apparently, the way that people are doing Scrum right now is causing pain and harm, and everyone's sensing that. And unfortunately, that way of doing it is still being sold. Oh, a bunch of familiar names on this meetup. That's cool. Now I'm more nervous than I was before. So let's get into the content. The definition, so the first definition I'll give you is system optimization goal. Or we typically call it an optimization goal for short. A lot of times, when I used to do Agile consulting, we would start by asking about pain points, which is close to the right question. It's on the boundaries of the right question. System optimization goal is something which is emphasized in less, as far as I can tell, more than the other methods that are there. We might consider some goals consistent with agility, or let's say adaptability. And we might consider other goals inconsistent with that, or even with each other. And I'm not seeing this emphasized enough in the people's work. And so we get arbitrary results. I was recently, I observed an overall retrospective. Overall retrospective is, by the way, great practice. It's in large-scale Scrum and probably intuitively obvious to people who have multiple teams doing Scrum. And that's where not only do teams do the retrospective at the end of a sprint, but teams of teams get together and they collaborate with each other and with the management of the organization and the product owner and the Scrum Masters about what are the systemic issues preventing the best delivery of value or best learning about what customer needs are. So an overall retrospective is a great practice. But if you take the practice without the understanding of why, you will wind up with arbitrary optimizations. And the place I was working with, they had, now their problems were caused by excess organizational complexity. And without the deep understanding of that and without clarity about the optimization goal of the overall retrospective, the management didn't agree about why they were doing this. Just send everyone to training is a typical pattern that we've seen a lot. But we don't actually know what problem we're going to solve. And so we wind up trying to solve contradictory problems, and we wind up with unimpressive results way too often. Ken Schwaber observed this very early when he wrote that in most organizations, I think he said 70%, most organizations trying to do Scrum won't get the benefit. 70% might have been optimistic that won't succeed at this or won't get the benefits that are intended in Scrum. Another related term that we'll use, local optimization bias. So the first term again was system optimization goal. Now I'll talk about local optimization bias. I will suggest that as human beings, we have a tendency to try to improve things. That's a natural thing to do. And of course, Scrum tries to do that. And typically the sprint retrospective is one of the places where we make adjustments. We try to optimize things. Now, the problem is that we tend to optimize around what's right in front of us, or what short term, something that's in, we're sort of wired for short term thinking, or what's immediately in front of us. And if we get into a large organization, we have 5 teams or 500 teams all trying to build a product together. Actions that you might take that might appear to be improving things in the local perspective actually will cause harm to the larger system. An example of this would be, we have got to improve our velocity. Our team has got to crank out more crap code that doesn't integrate with the other products, other teams, and ultimately the product goes out with more bugs and less understanding. So local optimization bias, very powerful thing. We're all subject to it. It permeates your organization. It's everywhere. I have it, you have it, and it takes conscious effort takes thinking slow and careful observation of our own actions to be aware of this local optimization bias. Otherwise, it'll be very hard to actually make an effective change to the larger system. Okay, I'll give a third definition, and then it's kind of my term or my twist on a term. I'll say knowledge creation work. Now, there was a term knowledge work that I think Peter Drucker popularized, which was creating value based on knowledge that we've acquired in the past. I will suggest for software development in particular, new product development in general, I will suggest knowledge creation work is different than the kinds of work that we're thinking about in a traditional factory, for instance. In a factory, our effectiveness, a lot of times, well, in a traditional factory, let's take an example of picking apples instead of factories, because factories are also getting smarter. Picking apples, the results of that are really down to how many apples I pick. And how many apples we pick together. And so the idea is that the effectiveness of the organization is the sum of each individual's output of doing that work. Knowledge creation work is a bit different. The analogy that I am stealing from Bus is, let's say you'd spend Monday through Thursday trying to get a software product to work. And it wouldn't have to be a software product if you're not a programmer. Think about a report you've written or some other product of your mind. And so you spent Monday working on it. You were totally stuck. You slept on it. Tuesday you woke up and you wound up throwing away everything you did on Monday because it was off track. Tuesday you did some research and you learned some things. You came up with some better ideas. Showed them to your colleague or maybe your spouse. By Wednesday you thought you got a good idea. You show it to more people, get feedback. You learn some more things. You discover something someone else has tried that didn't work. And then, so you keep some of what you did. Thursday, you've got something, you think it's in good shape now. And then Thursday night, you lose your files. And all the work you've done since Monday is lost. But is it really lost? It's not lost. On Friday morning, by 10 o'clock, or whenever you wake up, maybe an hour after you woke up, you'll be ahead of where you were Thursday night. And it's because the work you did wasn't typing. That was not the constraint. The limitation on knowledge creation work is learning. Your ability to create knowledge, learn things, and synthesize that, and learn and make something new. So we'll call this knowledge creation work, which is in some fundamental ways different than traditional management assumptions about what work is and what effective work is. Yeah, leading back to all kinds of optimizations, which are probably harmful towards agility. Now, we didn't define agility, did we? The way I'll use I'll suggest the focus of less is adapting, learning and adapting to reality as we discover it. This is what I thought the focus of Scrum was supposed to be also. We'll start from the assumption that we don't know everything about what the customer needs. We don't know everything about our own skills. We don't know exactly how or what we're going to do. And we would like to optimize our organization around the ability to have that, because we believe the company that can outlearn its competition is the one that will be more successful, is the one that will survive the rate of change, which is accelerating. All right, and then another fourth definition I'll give is private code ownership. Now, this doesn't exist as a distinction for many people because it's like fish not knowing about water. It's the habit in so many organizations now that only Bob can work on this, or maybe only Bob's team can work on this piece of software. Only another team can work on this piece of software. And if we're not using effective practices like test-driven development, like constant merciless refactoring, like continuous integration, if we don't have an internal open source policy, then perhaps private code ownership is a necessary reality. But we need to be able to recognize it and distinguish it when it's there, because it can be quite poisonous to the optimization goal if we're looking at the big picture, optimizing for a whole product view rather than just a micro view. I hope those definitions made some sense. If they did or they didn't, they'll be in the download, which we'll get this to you one way or another. We'll send you a link if you don't have it yet to download the thing that explains the comic book. By the way, I wrote this, these things are in response to comments mostly from Agile coaches. They'd say, I love the comic book. Now, tell us how to improve our velocity at the Scrum of Scrums. So they didn't quite get it. And so I tried to write more things to elaborate on why maybe those aren't the, depending on what your optimization goal is, coming back to that. But if your optimization goal is a learning organization, an organization that can adapt more quickly to customer needs, and probably in my, let's assume that there's at least a correlation between the ability to do that and customer satisfaction. Okay, now we'll get into the misconceptions. Misconception 1 is around dependencies. Actually, you could write a whole book just about this misconception because we have to go deep into it. Misconceptions in traditional work, dependencies are caused by real hard constraints that are somewhat bound to the laws of physics, I will suggest. If I'm going to build a skyscraper, there's not a whole lot of point in putting the carpeting in if I don't even have the hole in the ground yet. I can't do a lot of things because of the laws of gravity, because we can't really start digging the hole till we have whatever the machine is that digs the holes, et cetera. It doesn't matter if we have all the cement in the world if we can't do this. So it makes a lot of sense in traditional work to think about dependencies and to make a chart that maps them and to make kind of a project plan, especially if it's something we've done millions of times before, like Henry Ford making the Model T Ford. Then it makes perfect sense to focus on how things are dependent on each other and make a project plan based on that. I will suggest dependencies in knowledge work ultimately caused by knowledge gaps. If the constraint in knowledge work is the ability to create knowledge and to understand the customer's needs and the technology we're using and other things, how to work with each other, other things, the internal constraints in our organization, dependencies are softer than we thought they were. And maybe we need to look at ways of reducing their impact. I'll leave it at that for right now. I think we'll be coming back to that topic because people are really addicted to it. I will add a little side note to that though. If you've not had the experience of developing software recently or observing multiple teams developing software and getting actually the Gemba time, getting into the code with them, it will be hard to accept this, and I don't know how to persuade you of that. If you've spent more time with your eyes open, watching what teams are doing, getting into the code, seeing what the real constraints are, like my main client of the past few years, realize that the dependencies are being caused by the belief that they're real. They're being caused also by our organizational structure and policies. For instance, only this team does that, only this team does that. This team is driven by what I'll call team output owner, which means they have local optimization. They're focusing just on doing this. And what happens is we dig the rut deeper and deeper. What we need to look at is that introducing limitation on the whole organization's ability to adapt to reality and learn from it. And this leads us to misconception 2, which is very easy to believe this. I fall into this also. The idea that all teams are probably working on roughly equal value work. That is probably not true in your organization. It certainly isn't true from the places I've been working with. I think it's not hard for you to imagine a situation, let's say you have 12 teams doing something. Not hard to imagine a situation where the work of one team is 1,000 times more important than the work of another team. I don't think you can. Yeah, I don't think you have too much trouble imagining that happening uh, in, in a real organization, in a big company, after it's built up the silos. And there are things. Unfortunately, there are Scrum implementations or ways of introducing Scrum, which have made that worse, made this problem worse. And the illusion that we're doing the most important thing can be caused by local optimization bias and some other stuff, focusing just on our team's backlog, for instance. Uh, Having only our team's backlog to think about, having someone right in front of us on our team telling us what to do, rather than being able to look at the whole picture. And that leads to misconception number 3 in my list, which is, should the team have a narrow view or a whole product view? Now, what happens, unfortunately, is a tendency to optimize for velocity, our team velocity, and that leads to things like Scrum Masters preventing teams from talking to each other, because we want our team to just focus on their work, without regard for later on we'll get into the problems that causes. But right now, I'll just suggest that when we have a narrow view on the problem instead of a whole product view, if everyone's doing that, teams are all doing that, we wind up with results that are suboptimal for the whole product. We are not applying the power of team self-management to the whole product when we're doing this. So we want, and this is an assumption in the Agile Manifesto. I believe it because I've seen it. The best design requirements code come from self-organizing teams. And so we believe in self-organization that works. We extend that to even self-management in less, seeing it work, firsthand experience with that work. And without that firsthand experience, I'm not sure how persuasive I can be. I don't know if I can convince you without that, someone that hasn't had that experience. Let's talk about misconception 4. Now this actually breaks into a whole bunch of pieces. Misconception 4 is, will components from different teams integrate into a feature without those teams working together? And remember, we're talking about, this is the topic is less. The topic is large scale Scrum. If we have a single team organization, our company has just 12 people in it, which is my experience when I first started doing Scrum. And so I had a lot of ideas about how to make it work in a 12-person company. And some of those ideas not as helpful when we get into larger organizations. Will components from different teams integrate? So taking the Apple analogy, if we think that the result is the work product is just the result of all the apples that 1,000 people have picked, and we can just put them in boxes and ship them out, then we'll fall into this trap. But a software product is not that. A software product has lots of pieces that have to work together. Some people will call these dependencies. I'll call them shared work that has to happen. Will they just integrate into a feature without teams collaborating? And let's go into some of the subcases of this. Doesn't XYZ technical approach eliminate the need for teams to work together? Because we're having so much trouble, I guess, getting teams to work together. And I suggest these problems are actually caused by the policies and the structure of the organization, the organizational design. But because a lot of companies haven't solved that problem, we keep rolling out technical silver bullets that are supposed to solve this. I remember when there was something called remote procedure call was supposed to solve this. Remember when XML was supposed to call this. Remember when SOAP was supposed to call this. And now it's, 2020 already? Now microservices is supposed to solve this. And I won't comment on whether microservices is sound architecture in any given situation. It might be a sound technical approach, but it's sometimes being sold as a way to have teams that don't have to work together. And I don't expect it to be any more successful than the previous 20 years of silver bullets were for that problem. The XYZ technical approach does not eliminate the need for teams to work together. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use those approaches. They're great approaches. Just don't pretend it's going to solve the need for collaboration across multiple teams. This is something that we're very explicit about in LAS and large scale Scrum. How do we get teams to, how do we create the environment where teams will naturally work together? Okay, so that was 4.1.1. Doesn't XYZ technical approach eliminate the need for teams to work together? I don't think so. Okay, let's take 4.1.2, very related topic. Don't well-defined interfaces, open standards, etc., eliminate the needs for teams to work together? Now, let's be really clear. I'm a big fan of well-defined interfaces, open standards. I'm a huge fan of open source software, all those things. No opposition to any of that. That's great stuff. Let's not pretend it eliminates the need for teams to work together. So a well-defined API works when one side isn't changing. Situation with my client, and I think most real companies, is that both sides are changing. So we have a well-established API for some things, like HTTP. We have it, it's a great standard. And once we have that, then it means our team developing the browser doesn't have to work very closely with the team, or at all, perhaps, with the team developing the server. So in that situation where neither side are changing, at least the fundamental low-level interface like that, then there isn't a need for collaboration. But take a real product where we're doing something novel, and the thing that's being provided by this part of the software, the requirements for that will continue to evolve, just like they'll change on this side. So both sides are changing, and just making a book. Now, back when I started writing software, we had something called, it was aerospace. We had these things called interface requirements documents. And we would lock them down, get them signed off by everyone, because we know if we screw that up, it's going to be a huge pain in the future. This is all based on the idea that requirements won't change. I'm pretty sure in your life, the software you're developing, requirements are changing. And so trying to do it with a document isn't going to work in the future. This doesn't mean that we eliminate documentation. By the way, my favorite kind of specification is specification by example. An executable specification, an enabling specification. These are specs that don't lie. So someone told you Agile doesn't have documentation. I don't think that's true. We do have a specification, and it's ever evolving, and it's a living specification. And I personally like Cucumber for that. That's one of the things that we've recently worked with a company, helping them develop the skills and using Cucumber. It's a specification by example. These are great techniques for getting business people and technical people to work together. Now, in an Agile company, there wouldn't be an IT side and a business side, right? A truly Agile organization wouldn't have that. Specification by example, I think, is a useful bridge technique to help break down those boundaries, even though those boundaries shouldn't exist. Let's go to misconception 4.2. Will features from different teams integrate into one product without the teams working together? So we have team A and team B. Will their stuff just work together? So now we've gone to feature teams. So in the previous example, we're talking about we have component teams where we have a back-end team and a front-end team. And obviously there's a need for those. If we're organized that way, and probably mostly we shouldn't be organized that way, with some exceptions, we're going to have all kinds of problems. And especially if each team is focusing on their velocity of their output rather than the whole picture. Let's say, okay, now we've learned about feature teams. Now we have teams that can do front end and back end work and the middle tiers and all that stuff. That does not solve the problem completely. Now you should do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. You absolutely should consider doing that at least. But that doesn't solve the problems. Those teams will still need to work together. Whatever your model of the requirements is internally, it will change. I think Tyson said their plan is a plan. What is it? He said something about being punched in the face anyway.
Everyone has a plan. until they get punched in the face.
Yeah, thanks, Gene. And despite appearances, I haven't been punched in the face recently, but I'm pretty sure that this is a true thing, at least what happens with requirements. So we might have a plan how this team just does this work and that team just does that work. And now we have feature teams and they shouldn't have to talk, but they still do. They still do. But this team is going to do things and there aren't clear lines between what everyone's going to do. That you, at least if there are, you won't know what they are in the beginning. You'll discover them along the way. So teams still need to work together. Teams still need to work together. We still need this to happen. And so there's kind of a fantasy of eliminating shared work. A friend of mine says we actually want to increase shared work because we want teams to learn what other teams are doing and not have the narrow specializations that are leading to the bottlenecks. Come back to this point later on, possibly. All right, so 4.2 was, will features from different teams integrate in a product without teams work together? So even if we use feature teams, those teams still need to talk with each other. They'll still need to integrate their work. First through conversation and through technical integration, like continuous integration, elimination of branching, working on the trunk, internal open source policies, probably elimination of private code policies, practices over time. Remember, nothing we're talking about in less happens overnight. Less adoption is probably months or years, and then even ongoing after that. I don't believe in this is kind of why we avoid the word transformation. The word transformation, we don't call it a less transformation, because it implies, in some people's minds anyway, implies a project that we can get done. Okay, it's 3 months in, we've trained everyone, we're done with the transformation, perhaps we did a reorg, and now problem solved and we have agility. People used to call us, when I worked at another company, and they said, well, I want to buy the Scrum. And it's not something that works like that. You can't buy the Scrum. It's not a project, it's an ongoing adoption. And there are so many forces against this that it'll never end. Okay, misconception 4.3. This is maybe a special case, but it was maybe not. I had the recent situation, a place I worked with for a few years, where they had products. It was very difficult to define product. Now, the LESS book, my favorite LESS book, to start with, anyway, to begin with, is this book. I'm going to guess people on this meetup will be familiar with this book. Even better if you've read it. And one of the most useful, this is all useful, chapter 7 has a whole conversation about what is a product. Ellen also did a great talk about that, the topic of how do you know what your product is? And I will suggest places I'm seeing are making this decision arbitrarily. The decision about what a product is comes from an assumption that we haven't given careful and deep thought, because it has far-reaching implications, especially if we're serious about doing Scrum and we follow the rules. Defining product is a very serious decision with wide-ranging implications. And it's something that we give guidance about in chapter 7. How do you know what your product is? With a preference for a wide view, or thinking about a broad view, thinking about it. What would the customer say your product is, for instance? What's the vision? Are these things that we're calling separate products? I just want to give an extreme example of this. A friend of mine working with a company that does things related to online payments, that has 100 some odd teams, has 100 some odd products internally in their imagination of what their product backlogs are. And so they have nearly 100 so-called product owners. Now, if you read the comic book, you might be aware probably going to call those people team output owners, because it's a product that the customer really thinks is one product. Customer, I could see a case for 3 products. You might even know what product I'm talking about. If you use it, you probably think it's one product, maybe as many as 5, but it's not 118 products. And if we have 118 product backlogs, product owners, we're going to get all kinds of crazy optimizations, sub-optimizations, local sub-optimizations, which are harmful to the big picture. So come back to my story about the place I was working with. They have a tricky situation defining product, and it's not obvious to anyone what the product is, because they have parts that they sell individually, but those parts also have to work together with other things they sell individually. On top of that, their strategy is not to keep selling. Now, they're going to have to, for legacy reasons, they're going to have to keep selling the individual products. But their strategy, the reason that their stock price doubled, is that the products work together. This is, for instance, I use Google Tasks. It's not especially great. It's certainly not the best task management thing, but I use it because it integrates with Google Calendar, which is pretty good. Now, Google Calendar is not especially great either. I use that because I use Google Mail. And it's because these things work together that the total value, and this word synergy has been abused quite a bit since the 80s and 90s, but there really are synergies between these different things that they were calling products. And this is their strategy, is to have these products work together. Now, there are hundreds of people working on these products, and then so it leads to a very confusing problem of who is product owner and what is the product. And I'm not going to answer that for everyone because I don't know your situation. I will suggest something that very, say, influential people in the company need to have a serious discussion about and give it a lot of thought. So even if we sell this product, let's give an analogy. Well, yeah, with the Google things, or Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, which are supposed to work together, and they sort of do. Now, the reason I use one of them and other Adobe tools is because, despite all their flaws, is because they're supposed to work with the others. And they also will not integrate without teams working together. You won't be able, remember we're talking about XYZ technical approach, the technical magic. That only works if one side is not changing. But if all sides are changing, it's not going to happen without human beings talking to each other. And we keep trying to buy tools that will prevent the need for people to talk together because we're having trouble making it happen. And of course, it's easier to just buy a tool than to create the environment where people will talk together. Creating an environment where people will talk to each other is really hard. It's organizational simplification. It's a hard thing to do because it suggests changes to our structure. And now we have the problem of, well, we had all these manager roles. I manage these 3 people. She manages those 2 people. What do we do with that? What do we do about their job titles? So it's not an easy problem to solve, and it's not solved overnight. How to create safety for everyone that's involved with that, because we know that fear is going to shut down any kind of agile adoption. So I'm not going to pretend any of these things are easy problems to solve, but I wanted to at least shine a light on some of the problems that we have solving them. Now, in your download, we have the bonus content, which is, and if you've been thoroughly trained in less, you are going to know what this is already. 7 alternatives to Scrum of Scrums. Let's give a little history lesson. Where's the black book? So the first book about Scrum that Ken Schwaber and the late Mike Beagle wrote together. Can't see it with the reflection. There's some interesting ideas in this. You kind of, when you read this, you can also realize that they had some clues about how this worked and why it worked, but they also were still pretty confused about it. And this isn't recommended reading except for me anyway, except for historical purposes, though it contains some good ideas. But the good ideas from this book were distilled, and they wound up in Ken Schwaber's second book, which we used to call the Gray Book back when there were only 2 books. That was Agile Project Management with Scrum, his 2004 book. And you can see that the trajectory in thinking in this book, because they haven't really thought the scaling thing out. Well, it's not just they haven't thought it out, it's just they didn't seem to know how to make it work. And so I realized, well, Scrum works pretty well at this 12-person company, so, or the situation, which is this. So if we just add it all together, make more of these things, what we call copy-paste scaling, copy this effective pattern, the result, the sum of that should be effective. And if we think about that for a while and apply that to what we know about how knowledge work is different, we realize that, oh, it's not just adding stuff together. It's more complicated than that. It's not just like picking apples. But they had that. Yeah, they had the idea. And in this black book, they had the idea, and let me make it really clear, I do not recommend this. In this black book, the Scrum Master was coordinating for the team at the Scrum of Scrums in this book. Now, with fast forward to 2004, Ken Schwaber's now gains some wonderful insights through direct Gemba time, through observation of what actually happens, and through talking to other people. And a fellow named Mel Pullen pointed out, hey, the Scrum of Scrum things, I thought we were supposed to be reducing hierarchies. I thought the reason Scrum worked was that we have no special roles, no special people on the team. We're all just team members. We bring, of course, we have our own background. You know, maybe I was a software architect in a previous job. I know I'm great at drawing UML diagrams and other stuff like that. Maybe she was a UI designer, UX expert, but in the team room, it's at the team table, it's just us and our skills, and we're meant to leave our job titles at the door of the team room. And that's how single team Scrum works. And why wouldn't we try to use the same practices for multi-team Scrum? Which is why we'll suggest a whole bunch of alternatives which are decentralized. This is confusing to people because if we want to have a whole product view, we need a uniforms are not the right word. We need a shared sense of priorities. We need to know what's more important than something else. So we need a shared vision, and we need someone, at least there may be other ways to do it, but unless we have a product owner and a product backlog, and that says this is the direction we want to go. So that is centralized, if you like, but the how decisions, as much as possible, are decentralized among the people doing the work. And we want to create the environment where leadership emerges based on situational meritocracy, based on what has to happen. So maybe on Tuesday, team A needs to talk to team W about something, and so we want them to just talk. That's our first and our default approach. Someone on team A needs to talk to someone on the other team. We want to create the environment where they can just talk. Now that by itself is too general, too vague. How do I even know, if I'm on team A, how do I even know who I'm supposed to talk to on team W? So that by itself doesn't solve the problem. So there are other patterns, other structures that we can use. The point is that we want to not have special roles, special people. We want it decentralized and on demand based on situational need, which Scrum of Scrums will sometimes do that, but I'm not saying never do it. And if it's working for you, then keep doing it. But I will also say the ones I've seen didn't do it very well. The ones I've seen were optimizing for something other than adaptability. If we're optimizing our organization to learn new things, that means sometimes we'll be confused. It's necessary to sometimes be confused as part of learning our customers' real needs. There is a whole lot of pressure to never appear confused in companies. And we have a whole the level one management layer is to make sure people are never confused. And there's not very much patience with people sometimes being confused. And so if we optimize for lack of confusion, we're probably not effectively optimizing for learning, for satisfying the customer, for discovering the customer's needs, even though the customer can't tell you exactly what they need in the beginning. So other suggestions for ways of doing this that I've seen work, and once you've tried some of the other methods, I don't think you would go back to Scrum of Scrums as a default way for teams to coordinate. There are others to try. Now, if you try them all and then you go back to it, that would be, then I want to hear from you actually. That'd be something to consider. And it's something I'd want to look at more closely. So that was our bonus content. So The
Michael, quick,
reveal.
I'm checking. It's a
Oh,
T minus 13, just to pace
okay.
it. Okay.
Okay, so here's the big reveal, and then we'll go to, so one more topic, and then we'll go to all the questions, which hopefully people are tweeting to me or putting in the chat window to Gene.
A bit of both, I would think.
Okay, cool. And 90% of Agile, I used to say this also, of Agile coaches, trainers, even people who I have huge respect for, still have the idea that the way to make Agile work in a large organization is to divide the problem in the beginning and then let each of the teams do their hyper productive thing. And it makes sense in the beginning. It kind of like, okay, yeah, Scrum works for 7 people. So let's make part of the product for this team, part of the product for that team, part of the product for that team. For the reasons that we've gone through, I will suggest this is not optimizing in the big picture. In fact, it's actually counterproductive. It's harmful towards the whole product view. For the reasons that we went through before, we will wind up with each team has a narrow view. What we've done, if we prematurely make these decisions about which team is going to do what, make those, and we bake them into our organizational design, we bake them into our structure, we've not optimized for whole product agility. It's very likely we'll get teams working madly on their stuff, but we won't be able to change directions. They won't be having a whole product view. We'll wind up with teams doing work that's 1,000 times less important than other teams. Unfortunately, this is the default advice. Now, we used to talk in the introduction of, in early days of Agile, we heard a lot of discussions about big design up front being a not beneficial practice towards the Agile evolving software, growing software as we learn more about customer needs. When you prematurely divide the product into work that this team, that team does, what you've done is you've made a big prioritization decision right in the beginning, which we know is the one you know the least about your product. Was it Ron Jeffries or Chet Hendricks? Someone says, today is the dumbest day of the rest of your project. So making those decisions in the beginning, this team will do this team will do that, seems to make sense from a traditional perspective, but in the big picture, I will suggest it's actively harmful towards the whole product view, towards the ability for the whole organization or whole development organization to reprioritize and change directions and pivot, which is what organizations will need to do more and more in the future. So I hope I was successful at expressing that. I covered a whole lot of things, and usually there are things I forgot to say or steps that I left out. If it helps to read this on your own time, then we'll get this PDF to you somehow, 30-page supplement. This comes with the comic book. Oh, and I'll do a plug before we do the Q&A, because I have to stay in business. We are doing virtual, due to the situation, the health crisis, we've been permitted temporarily to do remote or virtual CSM. We've learned how to do this. It's not a bunch of slides. It's people working together on these. We recreate the in-person experience as best as we can with teams self-organizing. And so we can do that virtually, and also the less basics class. You should download here's the Japanese version of the comic book. You probably found this by now if you're at this webinar. You probably already know about the Scrum Master Checklist at scrummasterchecklist.org. You may or may not know about the free Scrum training series, where one of the few times I actually wear a hat. And to learn more about less, I will encourage you to definitely read this book and the others, but this is a good starting point. This is Large Scale Scrum, More with Less by Craig Larman and Buzz Fogarty. Okay. Why don't we start with Gene? We'll start with the questions that you're finding interesting that people are sending in. Sip of water.
Yeah, one, two. So I think I got at least one well-formulated, succinct question. I'm going to give it to you, and there are a few that I collected prior to this event. So let's go one. So the question came from the gentleman who's on the call. How does design and discovery work factor into the knowledge creation work? But should it be treated
fantastic
less? So just time back yourself to a minute or two if you would like. And
those are, I like that. Thank you for choosing that question, because this was some background. I was when I was back in the days of climbing the job title ladder.
You did, huh?
From lowly programmer all the way up to architect. Now I got the brass ring. I got the architect job title, and because I wanted this because I hate bad architecture. I hate badly designed software, and design. I was talking more about the design of the software internally. Now, design also means what the software looks like to the user experience of the software. Hugely important things. And there are, let's see, should we talk about how in single team Scrum, or single team Agile in general, Jim Shore wrote a paper called Continuous Design. And he told my story, so I didn't wind up writing the paper because he did it better than I could have, explaining how evolutionary design can happen even while we're delivering iteratively and incrementally. So it's useful to understand that from a single team's perspective first. I will suggest a huge part of this is de-emphasizing things like velocity or team output, because we're going to need, of course, we need to learn from customers every sprint. So we want to deliver something every sprint and get real life empirical feedback from them about it. But the reason we're doing this, at least if you share my optimization goal for the organization, the reason to do this is to increase our ability to learn what the customer really needs, and also increase our ability to learn what design we should have used. So I made great design decisions that looked great in the beginning, and it was through empirical experience that I learned to change those design decisions and be able to do this. This is part of the reason that we're fans of test-driven development. And this week, I'm taking a class from James Grenning about how he does test-driven development in C for language for embedded systems. He's teaching this remotely. Plug for that class. Okay, now how do multiple teams solve that problem? This is part of the reason. Some of the tools and techniques, and they're elaborated on at much greater length in the other two less books, which you also really need to read. I would suggest. Now, you might think this is a lot of pages. Think about the millions of dollars your company is wasting by doing these things badly. You can afford to read these books, seriously. Some of the suggestions are, some of the specific practices are, as the teams, we have multi-team collaboration. That means people on different teams need to be talking to each other. One of them, and we need to have communities of practice, and these cut across the teams. And we need to create the fluid environment. I tried to draw a picture of this in the comic book, where teams, there's no boundary between this team and that team. These people are meant to talk to each other as often as they need to. And a little bit of structure to make that possible. A specific technique we will encourage is the current architecture workshop. So in the current architecture workshop, someone who's, say, the expert or something that's worked on this thing for 25 years explains, we built it this way, and even though it doesn't seem to make sense, we didn't do it that way because we found out this didn't work with this technology. So here's the reason it's this way. And when you're working on this, definitely don't cross the streams, because that will cause bad things to happen. So we want that knowledge shared across the multiple teams. I'm not saying I'm not going to let anyone pretend that it's easy. This is hard to do. But if you're going to develop software with 20 teams, then this is how you can do it. Not necessarily recommending you use 20 teams. That'd be another conversation, though. All right. Hopefully I obliterated that question or avoided it.
Yeah, I'm just being also time conscious, Michael. 4 minutes before we have to wrap. Do you want me to give you another one from the?
Yeah.
Please to submit it.
Others, you can tweet to me and I'll get to them. Looks like some people have done that. At michael.james I'm home. I'll be later on. I'll be out of class later on this afternoon, so I can reply offline also.
So the two questions that I think you kind of covered indirectly, implicitly with your talk, so I'm going to skip those. There's one that is pretty interesting. In our organization, every team has its own product owner, and they use Scrum of Scrums to coordinate priorities of different teams. Why is it not a good idea to have product owners to be focused on individual team output? Velocity is also an important thing. By increasing velocity and decreasing time it takes to deliver, we are keeping our customers happy. Sounds like in doing something.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, assumptions, a lot of assumptions there. One of the reasons that I am preferring to work with people as high up in the organization as I can find, because their optimization goals are probably different than people in the middle layers of their vision of what's necessary to have a successful business and happy customers. Of course, we all want happy customers, so no one's disagreeing with that. I will suggest, especially the place I spent a lot of time with recently, and maybe this is confirmation bias, but their customers didn't care how fast, of their hundreds of people, they didn't care how fast Bob typed code. In fact, if you're looking at what's happening, Bob should type code slower if we're going to have happy customers, because they would spend so much time with all the bugs. So I will suggest, if you can write bug-free software already, who can write bug-free software? Well, companies like Hunter Industries, where they have teams are mob programming and they're doing test-driven development and continuous integration. So if you have a sign on the wall saying, it's been 30 weeks since we last released a bug to production. And by the way, we're deploying code twice a day. And we're learning from our customers each time we deploy. So once you've solved all that, and you're doing that with multiple teams, and the product is always what the customer wants, then think about doing that faster. Most teams are not got there yet, though. In Scrum, we have a concept, unless we have a concept of definition of done. And if I go in and look at your source code, I think I'm going to be skeptical whether trying to do stuff faster is actually going to lead to customer happiness. Trying to do things at the local level, local optimizations faster. Sometimes going slow to go fast is the way to think about it. So I hope that helps with that. It may not.
I think it does, Michael. I think we're on the hour, and what we're going to have to do is wrap, unless someone wants to say a few extra minutes and bug you with questions. So any closing statements? So from me, first of all, thanks to you personally for joining and entertaining us for an hour, to the crowd for joining and and asking questions privately. Also, we will entertain the possibility of recording this and making it public, right? On my end, yeah. It's great. Hopefully you're not too self-critical. And we will share the video if we have one, and your artifacts are out there available as well. To everyone, please do stay tuned for more virtual events that are coming in the pipeline. We'll try to make them great and valuable to all of you. And first and foremost, stay safe and
wash your hands.
Drink lots of liquids, right? Of different proof. It's up to you how you do it, but
I'm out of whiskey here. Send me whiskey, please.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you so much for having this, for running these sessions. I'm impressed with all the people you've been able to get here. It's
I track. It's like honey, flies light, flying honey. I'm just kidding. All right, we're gonna wrap it. Everyone join. Right. Enjoy the rest of the day or night, respectively, and we shall reconnect soon.
All right. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. Thank you.
I'm going to cut the video. I'm going to cut the event, and the recording is going to go to the cloud.
Okay.